May 12, 1945. Kreuzberg District, Berlin. 15-year-old Klaus Becker crouched behind a pile of rubble that used to be somebody's apartment building. Maybe somebody's home where a family had lived and eaten dinner and celebrated birthdays before the bombs came and turned everything into broken concrete and twisted metal. The Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon rested heavy and awkward across his thin shoulders, the weight of it making his arms ache. His hands shook, not just from fear, though there was plenty of that. An animal terror that made his stomach clench and his breath come in short gasps, but from exhaustion, from 3 days without real food, from the bone-deep weariness that comes when your body is operating on pure adrenaline and nothing else. The uniform they'd given him 2 weeks ago, when they'd conscripted him from his Hitler Youth unit and told him he was a soldier now, hung loose on his frame like a scarecrow's costume. He'd lost weight since then, probably 10 or 15 pounds from a body that had no weight to spare. The Volkssturm armband wrapped around his bicep, that strip of cloth that was supposed to identify him as a legitimate combatant under international law, felt like a noose tightening with every breath. Through the dust and smoke that hung over Berlin like a funeral shroud, turning the spring sunshine into gray twilight, he heard them coming. The grinding treads of American tanks, that distinctive mechanical clanking that made your teeth hurt and your bowels go liquid with fear. The shouts in English, words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was brutally clear. The systematic advance that had swept through the city block by block, house by house, street by street, reducing his unit. If you could call 12 terrified boys and 3 old men a unit, to a handful of survivors with nowhere left to retreat, his Hitler Youth training echoed in his head like a broken record. The same messages he'd heard every week for 5 years. The Americans are barbarians who will kill prisoners without mercy. They torture captured soldiers for entertainment. Better to die fighting for the Führer than surrender to beasts who show no humanity. His squadron leader, an SS officer named Scharführer Weber, who disappeared yesterday afternoon when things became truly hopeless, had been even more explicit in his final instructions. "They will torture you," Weber had said, his voice harsh and certain, looking each boy directly in the eyes. "They will do unspeakable things. Then they will execute you. Your only choices are to fight to the death, or use your last bullet on yourself. Never surrender. Death is preferable to what they will do to you." Klaus had believed it completely, with the absolute unquestioning certainty that comes from years of systematic indoctrination, starting when you're barely old enough to understand the words. Why wouldn't he believe it? It was all he'd been told since age 10 when he first joined the Jungvolk, the junior division of Hitler Youth. Americans were subhuman monsters, products of racial mixing and democratic weakness and Jewish corruption. Surrender meant torture and death. His only choices, the only honorable choices for a true German boy, were victory or death. There was no middle ground, no third option, no possibility of mercy. The tank rumbled closer, its engine sound growing louder, 30 meters away now, close enough that Klaus could see the white star painted on its side, the American markings that identified it as enemy machinery. Close enough he could hit it if he fired, maybe. Probably not, because he'd only practiced with this weapon once for about 10 minutes. But if he didn't at least try, if he didn't fight, he was a coward and a traitor. He was betraying the Führer, betraying Germany, betraying his family, betraying everything he'd been taught to believe in. Klaus lifted the Panzerfaust with arms that trembled so badly he could barely keep it steady, trying to remember the abbreviated training that was supposed to prepare him to fight professional soldiers. Point the tube at the target. Aim for the tracks or the engine. Press the trigger. His 14-year-old friend Friedrich had tried using one yesterday in this same neighborhood. He'd actually managed to fire it at an American tank. But the backblast, that jet of flame and gas that shoots backward when you fire, had knocked him unconscious, sent him sprawling, stunned in the street. He'd been shot while lying there helpless, killed by tank machine gun fire before he could even wake up, before he could run or fight or do anything except die bleeding in the rubble. Klaus's finger found the trigger, his palms sweaty against the metal despite the spring cold. The tank was maybe 25 meters away now, rolling slowly forward with its turret traversing left and right, looking for targets. Close enough he could definitely hit it if his hands would just stop shaking. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it physically hurt. This was it. This was the moment. He would fire and probably miss because he was terrified and untrained, and he'd only seen someone use this weapon properly once. Then the tank would kill him with its machine gun or its main cannon, and at least he would die fighting. At least he wouldn't be captured and tortured. At least his death would mean something. The tank stopped, its engine idling. The turret traversed, that massive gun barrel swinging toward his position like the finger of death pointing directly at him. Klaus closed his eyes, waiting for the main gun to fire, waiting for the explosion that would be the last thing he ever experienced. Instead, a voice, loud, amplified, coming through some kind of speaker system, speaking German. Terrible German with a thick American accent that mangled every syllable, but German nonetheless. "Come out, boy," the voice said. "Weapons down! We will not shoot!" Klaus froze, his eyes snapping open. They were calling him boy, not enemy, not German bastard, not Kraut, just boy. Like he was someone's son instead of a soldier. The voice came again, firmer now, but still not filled with the sadistic pleasure he'd been taught to expect from American monsters. "We won't shoot you. Put down the weapon. Come out with your hands up. This is your last chance." Klaus stayed frozen behind his rubble pile, his mind racing in circles. This was obviously a trick. It had to be. They'd shoot him the moment he showed himself. That's what the propaganda had been absolutely clear about. Americans killed prisoners, especially young SS and Volkssturm fighters. They tortured captured Germans, did terrible things that the propaganda films had shown in graphic detail. They were barbarians incapable of mercy or honor. But another voice in Klaus's head, quieter but insistent, whispered different words. The propaganda had also said the Wehrmacht would never retreat, that German forces were invincible, that victory was certain. Klaus had watched the Wehrmacht collapse in front of his eyes over the past month. He'd seen grown men, hardened soldiers, running in panic from advancing Americans. He'd seen Berlin burn, seen his city reduced to rubble. The promised secret weapons, the Wunderwaffen that were supposed to turn the tide and give Germany victory, had never appeared. The V-2 rockets hadn't stopped the bombers. The jet fighters hadn't ruled the skies. The promises of victory had been obvious lies. What if the propaganda about American brutality was also lies? What if everything he'd been told, everything he'd built his understanding of the world on, was false? His hands moved almost without conscious thought, setting down the Panzerfaust on the rubble, the weapon suddenly too heavy to hold. He stood slowly, his legs weak and trembling beneath him like they might collapse at any moment, raising his arms above his head in the universal gesture of surrender that transcended all language barriers. His voice cracked when he shouted back toward the tank, the words barely audible over the idling engine and the distant sound of artillery in other parts of the city. "Ich komm raus. Nicht schießen. I'm coming out. Don't shoot." 3 American soldiers appeared from behind the tank, moving quickly but carefully, their rifles raised but not firing, covering him as they approached with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. They were huge, or at least they seemed huge to Klaus, who'd been underfed for months and had probably lost 20 pounds from an already lean frame. The propaganda had told him Americans were weaklings, soft from easy living and democracy. But these men looked like giants in their combat gear, solid and well-fed and radiating competence. One was black. Klaus's stomach dropped, terror flooding through him in a cold wave. The propaganda had said black American soldiers were especially savage, that they were barely civilized, that they committed atrocities as naturally as breathing, that they showed absolutely no mercy to anyone, especially not to Germans. Klaus closed his eyes again, his body tensing, waiting for bullets or a bayonet, waiting for the beating and torture that he'd been promised would come. Someone grabbed his shoulder. Klaus flinched violently, expecting a knife or club or fist, expecting pain and violence. Instead, the hand steadied him, the grip firm but not brutal, almost gentle in a way that confused him completely. When he opened his eyes, one of the Americans, the black soldier he'd been taught to fear most of all, was standing right in front of him, close enough that Klaus could see his face clearly in the afternoon light. The soldier was young, maybe 23 or 24, with tired eyes that showed exhaustion and something that looked like concern rather than the cruelty Klaus had been promised he'd see. The soldier was holding out a canteen, a standard American military canteen, olive drab-colored. "Trinken," the American said in heavily accented German, the word coming out like trinken, with the emphasis all wrong but still recognizable. Drink. Water. Klaus stared at the canteen like it was a bomb about to explode in his face. He stared at the soldier's face, searching desperately for the cruelty and sadism he'd been promised he would find there. The inhuman brutality that marked Americans as monsters. Instead, he saw exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from too many days of combat. He saw something that might have been pity. He saw patience as the soldier waited, not forcing the water on him, just offering it. He saw humanity in a person he'd been taught was subhuman, barely even human at all. His hands shook violently as they reached for the water, reached for mercy offered by an enemy who was supposed to kill him but was instead trying to keep him alive. He drank, tilting the canteen back with trembling hands. The water was clean, cool, better than anything he'd tasted in weeks, possibly months. It wasn't poisoned. It wasn't drugged. It wasn't a trick. It was just water, just basic human compassion, given freely to a boy who'd been pointing a weapon at the person offering it minutes earlier. When he finished, gasping, having drunk too fast, the American took the canteen back, nodded once, and gestured toward the rear with his rifle. A motion that was completely clear, even without words. No torture, no execution, just water, a nod, and directions to join other captives who were sitting on the ground about 50 meters back, guarded but unharmed, some of them already eating from American rations that guards were distributing. Klaus walked toward the prisoner collection point in a daze, his mind unable to fully process what was happening. His entire worldview was collapsing with each step, every piece of propaganda crumbling like the buildings around him. The monsters were giving him water. The barbarians weren't executing prisoners on the spot. The people he'd been taught were subhuman, and savage were treating him with more basic human decency than his own government had shown in years. More kindness than the SS officer who'd abandoned them, more concern than the Nazi officials who'd sent children to fight tanks with World War I rifles and a few hours of training. Everything he'd believed was a lie, and the truth was so unexpected, so completely different from what he'd been prepared for, that his brain simply couldn't accept it. He couldn't process that the enemy might actually be more humane than his own side, that the people he'd tried to kill were the ones showing him mercy. The desperate gamble that was the Volkssturm, the People's Storm or People's Militia, represents one of the darkest chapters of Nazi Germany's final months. It was the regime's ultimate act of desperation and moral bankruptcy, a last-ditch attempt to stave off inevitable defeat by throwing children and elderly men against Allied armies that had already won the war in everything but the final surrender documents. Created by Hitler's decree on September 25, 1944, when it was already crystal clear to anyone paying attention that Germany had comprehensively lost, The Volkssturm conscripted all males aged 16 to 60 who weren't already serving in some military capacity. In theory, this was supposed to create a massive home defense force of millions. In practice, as Germany's situation grew more desperate with each passing day and week, the age limits became suggestions rather than rules, guidelines that could be ignored when convenient. Boys as young as 12, some even younger, found themselves drafted, pulled from their homes and schools and Hitler youth meetings with minimal notice. Some volunteered, their heads stuffed full of years of propaganda about dying gloriously for the Führer being the highest honor a German could achieve. Others were essentially kidnapped, taken from schools or homes by SS or Nazi Party officials, given armbands that were supposed to identify them as legitimate combatants under the Geneva Convention, handed obsolete weapons that barely functioned, then sent to defend positions against professional armies with tanks and artillery and overwhelming air superiority. The numbers tell a story of systematic child sacrifice on a massive scale. Total Volkssturm conscription between 1944 and 1945 reached approximately 6 million men and boys on paper. Though many units existed only in planning documents, phantoms created by desperate bureaucrats to fill quotas. Actual combat deployment was roughly 1.5 million. The ones who actually saw real action, who actually fought and died. Teenagers in combat, boys aged 12 to 17, numbered an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 across all fronts. Think carefully about that number. 100,000 children, some barely old enough for middle school, some still years away from being able to drive a car, or vote, or drink alcohol, sent to fight against armies that had crossed oceans and continents and defeated professional German forces. Casualties among teenage soldiers were catastrophic and heartbreaking. Estimated 40,000 to 60,000 killed in action. 40,000 children dead. Bodies lying in rubble or buried in mass graves, or never found at all. Another unknown number wounded, maimed for life, carrying physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The training period was typically 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes only days, when units were being hastily formed to plug gaps in collapsing defensive lines. Sometimes, as combat units disintegrated and replacements were desperately needed, training consisted of showing a boy how to fire a rifle once, maybe twice if there was ammunition to spare, then sending him directly to the front. Equipment was whatever could be scraped together from warehouses and armories. Obsolete rifles from World War I, weapons that were 40 years old and barely functional, captured weapons that nobody else wanted, rifles taken from Polish or French or Soviet forces and issued to children who'd never seen them before. Panzerfausts, the German version of an anti-tank rocket launcher, which required almost no training to use, but which had a dangerous backblast that could kill the operator if used incorrectly or in an enclosed space. Makeshift explosives cobbled together from whatever materials were available. Bombs that were as dangerous to the person carrying them as to any enemy they might be used against. To hurry, children recruited into this doomed force had been systematically conditioned by years of Hitler Youth indoctrination, a process of psychological manipulation that was remarkably sophisticated and started when they were barely old enough to understand what was happening to them. They'd been taught from age 10, sometimes younger, that dying for the Führer was glorious, the highest possible honor a German could achieve, better than anything else they could do with their lives. That retreat was cowardice, a betrayal of everything German and noble. That surrender was unthinkable dishonor, worse than death, something that would stain their families forever. They'd been shown propaganda films, sophisticated productions that portrayed Allied soldiers as subhuman monsters who committed atrocities casually, who tortured prisoners for entertainment, who violated every rule of civilized warfare without hesitation. They genuinely believed, with the certainty of religious conviction, that capture by American forces meant torture followed by execution. Klaus Becker's experience was absolutely typical, a pattern repeated tens of thousands of times across Germany's collapsing fronts. 15 years old when conscripted, he'd been in Hitler Youth since age 10, when membership became effectively mandatory for all German children. 5 years of weekly meetings, 2 or 3 times a week during peak indoctrination periods. Military drills teaching basic marching and formations. Ideological training hammering home Nazi beliefs about German racial superiority and the subhuman nature of enemies. Physical conditioning through sports and hiking and camping trips. All of it designed to create loyal Nazi believers who would fight to the death when called upon. When the Volkssturm conscripted him in early April 1945, barely a month before the war would end in complete German defeat, he'd been terrified because he wasn't stupid and knew the war was lost, but also oddly proud. He was defending Berlin, his city, his home. He was fighting for Germany even if Germany was losing. He was serving the Führer even though the Führer had sent him to die. The propaganda had worked exactly as Nazi planners intended. The reality of actual combat shattered those carefully constructed illusions within hours, sometimes within minutes. His unit received exactly 3 days of training, 72 hours to learn how to fire a rifle, how to use a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, where to aim at American tanks to have any chance of disabling them. Basic stuff that professional soldiers learned over months that they were expected to absorb in days. Then they were sent to defensive positions in the Kreuzberg district of Berlin with simple instructions. Hold against American forces advancing through the district. Fight to the last man. Never surrender. Delay the enemy as long as possible, even though delay was pointless, because the war was already lost. We were 12 boys and 3 old men. Klaus recalled in a detailed 1987 interview conducted by a German university researcher studying Volkssturm experiences. The oldest boy was 17, tall and trying to grow a mustache to look older. The youngest was 13, a kid named Peter who still had baby fat on his cheeks, who should have been in school learning mathematics and history, not carrying a rifle. We had 8 rifles between us, most of them old Mauser 98Ks from the First World War, and 4 Panzerfausts, and maybe 50 bullets total for all the rifles combined. Our officer was an SS corporal, Scharführer Weber, who told us we'd be shot as deserters if we retreated. Then he disappeared late on the first day, when actual American forces showed up with tanks and artillery. We were children with guns, absolutely terrified, hungry because rations had stopped coming days ago, waiting to die for a regime that clearly didn't care whether we lived or died. The propaganda that killed German children wasn't just propaganda in the casual sense of biased information or selective truth. It was systematic psychological conditioning designed specifically to make children prefer death to surrender, to choose dying in combat over the possibility of surviving as prisoners. Nazi propaganda had spent literally years, entire childhoods, conditioning German youth to fear capture more than death itself, to believe that surrender to Allied forces, especially American or Soviet forces, meant fates genuinely worse than dying on the battlefield. The messaging was systematic and pervasive, coordinated across every institution that touched children's lives, reinforced constantly until it became truth in the minds of young believers. School textbooks contained detailed descriptions of Allied atrocities presented as documented fact rather than propaganda fiction. History books described how American soldiers supposedly behaved in occupied territory, emphasizing torture and execution of prisoners. Geography books discussed the barbaric nature of different peoples, teaching racial hierarchies that placed Germans at the top and their enemies far below. Even mathematics problems were designed to reinforce propaganda. If an American bomber carries 2,000 kilograms of bombs and drops them on German cities, killing 500 civilians per raid, How many children will 10 bombers kill? Radio broadcasts on Reichsrundfunk, the state-controlled radio system that was the only source of news for most Germans, detailed supposed massacres of German prisoners in elaborate fictional accounts presented as war correspondence reports. Films shown in schools and Hitler Youth meetings portrayed American and British soldiers as sadistic monsters who enjoyed inflicting pain, who committed war crimes as casually as eating lunch, who violated every rule of warfare and human decency. Hitler Youth leaders, the adult instructors who ran the weekly meetings and summer camps, reinforced these messages constantly in both formal lessons and casual conversation. Surrender means torture, they said over and over. The Americans will do terrible things to you if you're captured. Better to die fighting than face what they'll do. If you can't fight anymore, save your last bullet for yourself. That's what a true German does. For children who'd been immersed in Nazi racial ideology from age 6 or earlier, children who'd been taught, since they could understand language, that they were Aryans who were racially superior to everyone else, that Germans deserved to rule the world, and others deserved only to serve or die. This propaganda found extremely fertile ground. They'd been systematically conditioned to believe that Germans were inherently better, stronger, purer than other peoples. The idea that these inferior, subhuman enemies would commit atrocities when they won seemed not just plausible but logically inevitable. If enemies were barely human, if they were more animal than man, why wouldn't they act like savage animals when given the chance? If Americans were mongrels produced by race mixing, if they were corrupted by democracy and capitalism and Jewish influence, of course, they'd be incapable of civilized behavior. The psychological impact of this sustained indoctrination was profound and often permanent. Many German child soldiers genuinely believed, with absolutely unshakable conviction, that death in combat was objectively preferable to capture and imprisonment. Some carried cyanide capsules, little glass vials of poison to bite down on if capture seemed imminent. Poison provided by SS officers who told them this was mercy. Others saved their last bullet specifically for themselves, having been instructed that shooting yourself was better than letting the enemy take you alive. Still others would fight to the point of complete physical collapse, would keep shooting even when wounded and bleeding out, would never raise their hands in surrender even when resistance was clearly futile, because surrendering violated everything they'd been taught about honor and duty, and what it meant to be German. The concept of American mercy, of enemies who actually followed the Geneva Convention and treated prisoners humanely and didn't torture or execute captives, was literally unimaginable to these children. It contradicted everything their entire worldview was built on, every assumption they'd been taught to accept without question. If they'd spent their entire conscious lives being told that Americans were monsters, that surrender meant death anyway, why would they ever choose surrender over fighting? 16-year-old Hermann Schultz, who was captured near Würzburg in April 1945 and survived to tell his story in multiple interviews over subsequent decades, described the absolute terror he felt when American soldiers surrounded his defensive position and called for surrender. In German using loudspeakers, I'd been told for years that Americans skinned prisoners alive, he said in an emotional 1990s interview that was recorded and preserved. That they cut off body parts as trophies, collecting ears and fingers, keeping them in jars like specimens. That they tortured Germans for entertainment, for fun, because they were sadistic monsters who enjoyed inflicting pain. I believed this completely, because it's all I'd ever been told, and I had no reason to think it was lies. When American soldiers surrounded our position in a ruined building and called for us to surrender, called out in German that they wouldn't shoot if we came out with our hands up, I tried to kill myself. I literally tried to commit suicide rather than surrender, because I thought death by my own hand would be better than what they'd do to me. I put my rifle barrel in my mouth, my finger on the trigger, and I started to squeeze. An American soldier, I found out later his name was Private Anderson from Iowa, somehow got into the building and knocked my rifle away before I could fire. Hit it so hard it went flying across the room. I was crying, absolutely hysterical, begging him in German and broken English to just shoot me quickly, to make it fast, to not torture me first. He looked absolutely horrified, completely shocked. He kept saying something I didn't understand at the time, the same words over and over while he tried to calm me down, tried to make me understand I wasn't going to be hurt. Later, after I learned English, I realized what he'd been saying. Jesus Christ, he's just a kid. Jesus Christ. Over and over. But at that moment, I thought his horror was fake, that he was just surprised I'd tried to kill myself, that he was preparing to do terrible things, and I'd ruined his fun. I was waiting for the torture to start. Instead, he gave me water and called for a medic because I'd hurt myself struggling, and treated me with more gentleness than anyone in the German military had shown me in months. This profound psychological conditioning made German child soldiers extremely dangerous in combat despite their lack of training, poor equipment, and obvious physical disadvantages. They would fight with genuinely suicidal determination, knowing or believing that capture meant fates literally worse than death, that there was no point in conserving ammunition or trying to retreat, because the only outcomes were victory or death. American forces advancing through Germany in March, April, and May of 1945 encountered fanatical pockets of resistance from teenagers who'd been psychologically primed to prefer death over surrender, who'd been told their entire lives that Americans were monsters, and who saw no reason to doubt it. The first encounters between professional American combat troops and German child soldiers created situations that absolutely nothing in military training or doctrine had prepared anyone to handle. Combat veterans who'd fought their way across Europe from Normandy or Italy, who'd seen some of the worst combat of the war, who'd fought professional Wehrmacht units and hardened Waffen-SS troops, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who were obviously children. Boys with adolescent faces that still showed baby fat despite malnutrition. Teenagers who were swimming in uniforms several sizes too large because there hadn't been time or resources to find anything that fit properly. The cognitive dissonance was immediate, profound, and deeply disturbing psychologically. These were children, obviously children, some of them young enough to be the American sons or little brothers. But they were armed. They were shooting with intent to kill. They were enemy combatants engaging in combat operations against American forces. And military doctrine, the rules of engagement that governed how American soldiers were supposed to behave, was absolutely clear on this point. Armed enemies were legitimate targets regardless of age or any other factor. If someone was shooting at you, you shot back. Period. There was no exception for children in the Geneva Convention or American military law. A 15-year-old with a rifle was a combatant, not a civilian. But the emotional reality was vastly more complicated than any rulebook or regulation could address. American soldiers who'd spent months fighting Wehrmacht professionals, men who'd killed German soldiers without tremendous moral anguish, because those were enemy combatants in a war that had clear moral lines, found themselves deeply uncomfortable shooting at teenagers. The faces were wrong. The ages were wrong. The sizes were wrong. Everything about these opponents violated fundamental human instincts about protecting children, instincts that transcend culture and nationality. Some American soldiers hesitated when facing obvious child soldiers, and that hesitation was sometimes fatal with tragic consequences. German child soldiers, despite their lack of training and experience, did kill or wound American troops whose human decency made them pause, who saw a 14-year-old boy pointing a rifle and couldn't pull their own trigger fast enough because something deep in their brain was screaming that you don't shoot children. Others overcame their initial hesitation and fired, did what they'd been trained to do, and killed the enemy combatant, then spent the rest of their lives dealing with the profound psychological consequences, suffering nightmares and guilt and moral injury that therapy and time could never fully heal. Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 3rd Infantry Division, who fought from North Africa through Sicily and Italy and France into Germany, described in painful detail his first encounter with Volkssturm child soldiers during the Battle of Nuremberg in April 1945, an experience that haunted him until his death in 1998. We were clearing the city sector by sector, house by house, just like we'd done in 100 other towns. Standard procedure we'd executed so many times it was almost automatic. You secure the street, you clear buildings methodically, you move forward. Fire came from a building, automatic weapon fire, an MG-42 machine gun by the sound, that distinctive fast rate of fire. The fire was accurate, nearly hit 2 of my men, rounds cracking past close enough to feel the shock wave. We returned fire, exactly like training dictated, threw grenades through the windows, then stormed the position with rifles ready. Inside we found 5 kids, maybe 14 or 15 years old, one still in a Hitler Youth uniform because they hadn't even bothered to give him proper military clothing. 2 were dead from our grenades, their bodies torn apart. 3 surrendered, dropped their weapons and raised their hands, and they were absolutely terrified, crying, visibly shaking, clearly expecting us to execute them on the spot, because that's what they'd been told would happen. The guy next to me, Private Miller from Ohio, started crying too. Just broke down right there. He had a son about that age back home, a 14-year-old boy he hadn't seen in over a year. He kept saying over and over, "Oh God, we just killed children." We killed kids because they were shooting at us. There was no good answer to that situation, no training that prepared us for it. We did what we had to do to survive, but it broke something inside all of us. I still see their faces sometimes at night when I can't sleep. These repeated encounters created absolutely impossible moral dilemmas, ethical situations that existed in a gray zone where there were no clean answers or right choices. German children, systematically indoctrinated and armed by a regime that was happy to sacrifice them, posed genuine threats to American soldiers trying to survive combat and complete their missions. But killing children, even armed and hostile children who were actively trying to kill you, violated fundamental human instincts that evolution has embedded in our species, violated the basic norms of civilized warfare that distinguish soldiers from murderers. American soldiers found themselves caught between military necessity and moral revulsion, between the immediate survival need to eliminate enemy combatants and the longer-term psychological cost of having killed teenagers who should have been in school. The informal solution that many American units adopted, without explicit orders from higher command but through spontaneous consensus among soldiers and junior officers making decisions in real time, was aggressive attempts to prioritize capturing rather than killing when encountering obvious child soldiers. When facing defensive positions that were clearly manned by children rather than adults, American forces would modify their tactics. They'd call for surrender in German before engaging, using phrases like "Kommt raus, Hände hoch," "Come out, hands up." They'd use loudspeakers if available to broadcast surrender appeals, sometimes having German-speaking soldiers or even German POWs make the calls. They'd hold fire longer than was tactically prudent, giving children more time to decide to surrender, accepting greater risk to themselves to avoid killing kids. Some soldiers would deliberately aim to wound rather than kill when they had to shoot, targeting legs instead of center mass, even though this violated their training and put them at greater risk. Others would bypass child soldier positions entirely when tactically possible, leaving them for follow-on units to deal with, moving around resistance rather than through it if the mission allowed. This wasn't official policy, codified in any manual or order. No general issued a directive saying, "Be gentle with child soldiers." These were individual moral choices made by soldiers and small unit leaders who decided they'd rather risk their own lives than kill children, if there was any viable alternative. Private Eugene Henderson, a rifleman with the 1st Infantry Division who fought from D-Day through the end of the war, described the personal rules of engagement he developed for himself when dealing with child soldiers. Guidelines he followed to preserve some sense of moral decency in an indecent situation. If I saw a kid, and I mean obviously a kid, not just someone young-looking, with a gun pointing it at me or my buddies, I would try absolutely everything possible to get him to surrender before I would shoot to kill. First, I'd yell in German, Waffe runter, Junge, weapons down, boy, a phrase I'd specifically learned and practiced for exactly this situation. I'd yell it multiple times, then I'd fire warning shots if I had time, bullets deliberately aimed to miss, but come close enough to scare, to show I was serious, and had them zeroed. I'd wait as long as I possibly could, longer than training said I should, longer than was tactically safe, because if I killed a child, even an armed enemy child who was trying to kill me, I genuinely wasn't sure I could live with that memory. Some guys in my unit did have to kill kids when the kids wouldn't stop fighting, when they'd exhausted every option and it was kill or be killed. I don't judge those guys at all. They did what they had to do. But I personally tried everything in my power to avoid it, to give every kid every possible chance to choose life over death. At the command level, among officers responsible for entire units rather than individual soldiers, informal policies and practices emerged for handling captured child soldiers differently than adult German POWs. These weren't official regulations written into any manual or promulgated through formal orders that would create a paper trail. They were practical accommodations and humanitarian impulses that officers implemented because they found themselves holding enemy combatants who were obviously children and couldn't in good conscience treat them exactly like adult prisoners. Medical care was quietly prioritized for wounded children, with combat medics and doctors instructed to treat the youngest prisoners first, when resources were limited. Food rations were increased beyond standard POW allotments because the kids were so obviously malnourished, sometimes receiving the same rations as American soldiers rather than reduced POW rations. Interrogations were conducted more gently, without the psychological pressure tactics sometimes employed on adult prisoners, with officers understanding these were frightened children, not hardened Nazis. Repatriation to families was expedited whenever possible, with child POWs processed and released faster than adults, sometimes within weeks rather than months. Living conditions in temporary holding areas were improved, with child prisoners separated from hardcore Nazi adults when possible to prevent further indoctrination or abuse. These adaptations weren't mandated by Geneva Convention requirements or Army regulations. They happened because American soldiers and officers, whatever their other flaws, generally drew moral lines about how to treat children even when those children were technically enemy combatants. The psychological impact on American troops who fought against and captured child soldiers was significant and surprisingly long-lasting, creating moral injuries that persisted for decades after the war ended. Many soldiers struggled with having killed children in combat, even when those actions were unquestionably justified under every law of warfare, even when the clear alternative to shooting was being killed themselves. The knowledge that they'd ended the life of a 14 or 15-year-old, that they'd killed someone who should have been in school, not on a battlefield, created guilt and anguish that therapy and time could diminish but never fully heal. Unit chaplains, the military officers responsible for soldiers' spiritual welfare, reported significant increases in counseling requests from soldiers struggling with moral issues related to child soldiers. Some soldiers wrote letters home trying to process what they'd experienced and done, trying to articulate feelings they didn't fully understand themselves. Corporal James Walsh wrote to his wife in May 1945, a letter preserved in family archives and later donated to the National World War II Museum, capturing the moral complexity perfectly. I killed a German boy yesterday who couldn't have been older than 14, maybe younger. He had a Panzerfaust and was about to fire at our tank from maybe 20 meters away. I shot him twice in the chest. It was completely justified under every rule of warfare anyone has ever written. He was armed, He was hostile, he was dangerous, he was about to destroy our tank and kill everyone inside, including my best friend. If I hadn't shot him, he would have killed Americans. But he was a child, Sarah. A child who should have been in school, playing with friends, living a normal life. When I close my eyes at night, I see his face, that expression of surprise when the bullets hit him, the way he dropped the weapon and fell. I don't know how to feel about this. I'm glad I'm alive. I'm glad my buddies are alive. I'm grateful I survived to maybe come home to you. But I'm haunted by his death, by the fact that I killed a child who never should have been on that battlefield. This was Hitler's crime, sending children to die for his insane dreams. But I was the one who pulled the trigger. How do I live with that for the rest of my life? Klaus Becker's transformation, the psychological journey from indoctrinated Hitler youth to disillusioned prisoner who questioned everything he'd been taught, began the moment he surrendered and discovered that everything he'd been told about American brutality was completely false. For Klaus, sitting with 13 other captured Volkssturm members in a makeshift American collection point set up in what used to be somebody's shop, 14 boys ranging in age from 13 to 17 years old. The realization came in stages like a building collapsing floor by floor. First came the immediate relief of not being executed, that overwhelming sense of still being alive when you expected to be dead. American soldiers had given them water first, then field rations, those K-ration boxes with crackers and cheese and chocolate, then blankets against the spring cold that seeped into your bones. A medic was moving among them, treating minor wounds. A young corpsman who couldn't have been much older than 20, showing no cruelty, just professional medical care given to children who'd been trying to kill Americans hours earlier. Guards watched them, but showed no signs of preparing for torture or execution, just bored professionalism. The expected atrocities that propaganda had promised weren't happening. Instead, Klaus observed Americans behaving like soldiers doing a job, not monsters preparing to torture captives. They'd secured the prisoners efficiently, provided basic necessities, and then moved on to other tasks because they had more important things to do than torture children. The captured boys weren't special targets of revenge. They weren't objects of hatred. They were just another administrative problem to process, another group of POWs to feed and guard and eventually transport to permanent camps. This absolute normality was psychologically devastating in ways that cruelty might not have been, because it demolished Klaus's entire understanding of who the enemy was. Klaus had spent weeks preparing himself mentally to die gloriously for Germany, had been conditioned to expect that capture would mean unspeakable torture before execution. Instead, he was sitting on rubble eating dry American crackers while his captors mostly ignored him because they had roads to clear and buildings to search and a city to secure. The disconnect between expectation and reality was so profound that his mind struggled to process it, kept trying to find the trap, or the trick, or the moment when the cruelty would start. I kept waiting for the torture to begin, Klaus recalled in a detailed 1987 interview. Every time an American walked past, I'd tense up, expecting violence. I'd watch their faces, studying them, trying to see the cruelty I'd been promised was there, the sadistic pleasure in hurting prisoners that propaganda films had shown me. But they just looked tired, professional, human. One was eating chocolate, breaking off pieces from a Hershey bar and chewing slowly like he was savoring it. Another was reading a letter from home, his expression going soft as he looked at whatever his family had written to him. A third was cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency, the movements automatic from repetition. They weren't monsters preparing to torture us. They were just soldiers doing their jobs, and their jobs apparently included not killing prisoners, treating children with basic decency, even when those children had been enemies hours before. An African-American soldier, the same one who'd given Klaus water when he first surrendered, the one whose skin color had terrified Klaus because of years of racist propaganda, approached the group of prisoners carrying a crate. Klaus flinched instinctively, old conditioning kicking in, expecting violence because everything he'd been taught said black soldiers were the most savage, the most dangerous, barely civilized. The soldier noticed Klaus's flinch, saw the fear in his face, and stopped walking, standing still about 2 meters away. He spoke in careful German, words that had clearly been practiced and chosen specifically to address the fear he saw in these children's faces. "Niemand wird dir wehtun," he said slowly and clearly. "No one will hurt you. You are safe now. The war is over for you." Klaus stared at him, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing and hearing with everything he'd been taught for years. An American soldier, a black American soldier, someone propaganda had portrayed as barely human, as savage and cruel and incapable of mercy, was reassuring him of his safety, using words deliberately chosen to address the terror that Nazi indoctrination had created, showing genuine concern for a child who'd been pointing an anti-tank weapon at Americans just hours earlier. "That was the moment," Klaus said decades later in multiple interviews, his voice still emotional even 50 years after the fact. "That's the exact moment when everything I believed just collapsed like a house of cards. When that soldier told me in careful German that no one would hurt me, and I could see in his eyes that he genuinely meant it, that he actually wanted to reassure a terrified enemy child, that's when I understood. Everything I'd believed was propaganda and lies. Every single thing. The lies about American brutality. The racial superiority nonsense that said some people were subhuman. The faith in the Führer and his promises of German victory. All of it was false. All of it. Because a man I'd been taught was inferior, subhuman, dangerous, was showing me more humanity and genuine concern than my own government had demonstrated in years. More kindness than the SS officer who'd abandoned us to die. More compassion than the Nazi officials who'd sent children to fight tanks with rifles, and a few days of training. I'd been lied to about everything, and the truth was so different from the lies that my entire worldview just shattered completely. The POW camps where German child soldiers were sent after initial processing became spaces where Nazi indoctrination systematically collided with reality, and reality won decisively. The camps held mixed populations reflecting the chaotic end of the German military. Wehrmacht veterans who'd fought since 1939, Waffen-SS troops, Volkssturm members ranging from teenagers to men in their 60s. The younger prisoners quickly became known to American guards and camp administrators who, despite having no official policy requiring it, made informal accommodations for their age because they were human beings who couldn't treat children exactly like adult prisoners. Extra food rations were common, with children receiving additional calories beyond standard POW allotments because they were so obviously malnourished, sometimes getting nearly the same rations as American soldiers. Educational programs were organized by officers who understood these kids had missed months or years of schooling, basic reading and mathematics, and even vocational training. Some camps actively separated child prisoners from hardcore Nazi adults to prevent continued indoctrination or abuse, creating separate barracks where the youngest POWs could be monitored and protected. American chaplains, those officers responsible for spiritual welfare, paid special attention to younger prisoners, concerned about psychological damage and future prospects, trying to help traumatized children process what had happened to them and begin healing. Klaus Becker spent 7 months in a POW camp near Mannheim, from May 1945 when he was captured until December 1945 when he was finally repatriated, and his experience there systematically contradicted everything propaganda had promised about American captivity. "We were fed regularly and adequately," he recalled, "better than I'd eaten in months before capture. Honestly better than I'd eaten since probably 1943. 3 meals a day. Not gourmet food, but enough calories to function and slowly regain weight. We had shelter in real buildings with roofs and walls, not rubble piles or bombed-out basements. Medical care whenever we needed it, American doctors and medics who treated us without cruelty. even some organized recreation, sports, and games, because the Americans understood that bored prisoners caused problems. The guards were professional, following rules, not cruel or sadistic. Some were actually kind, especially to the younger prisoners. I learned English from a guard, an American corporal named Williams from Pennsylvania, who brought me books from the camp library, teaching materials designed for American children learning to read. He had 2 sons my age back home, and he told me that, showed me their pictures. He treated me almost like I was one of his own kids, with patience and genuine concern for my welfare and future. The camps became sites of what Americans called denazification, though it happened more through direct daily experience than through formal re-education programs or lectures. Child soldiers who'd believed in Nazi ideology with religious fervor discovered through months of living under American control that Americans weren't monsters, that propaganda had been systematically false, that everything they'd suffered and fought for had been based on lies. Herman Schultz, the 16-year-old who'd tried to commit suicide rather than surrender, described his slow psychological transformation over 6 months of captivity. I had time to think for the first time in years, time without constant fear and without propaganda being screamed at me every single day from every direction. I talked to other prisoners, including older Wehrmacht veterans who'd seen more of the war than I had, who'd fought in Russia and France and Italy. And some of them quietly admitted that the war had been wrong from the beginning, that Hitler had led Germany to complete ruin for nothing. I saw every day how Americans treated us, fairly and humanely, without the systematic cruelty we'd been promised, without the torture and execution. Slowly, painfully, like pulling out something embedded deep in your flesh. I had to face the truth. I'd fought for evil. I'd been taught lies my entire childhood. I'd nearly died for a regime that had betrayed every German. Americans weren't the enemy. The Nazis were the enemy. The people who'd lied to us, who'd sent children to die, who'd destroyed our country. Understanding that truth was extraordinarily painful but absolutely necessary. It was the only way to move forward. The only way to build any kind of future. The repatriation process when German child soldier POWs were finally released and sent back to their families after months in American custody carried profound implications that would shape post-war Germany for generations. Klaus Becker returned to Berlin in November 1945, 6 months after the war had ended, 6 months after his capture. The city he returned to was virtually unrecognizable, destroyed so thoroughly by bombing and artillery that entire neighborhoods were gone, reduced to rubble and ash. His family's apartment building no longer existed, just a pile of broken concrete and twisted metal where home used to be. His father was dead, killed on the Eastern Front in late 1944, one of millions of German soldiers who died for nothing. His mother was living in a basement with 3 other families, barely surviving on minimal rations in a city where infrastructure had collapsed. But Klaus himself was relatively healthy, certainly healthier than most Berliners, well-fed from 6 months of American POW rations, wearing American-supplied clothes because his Volkssturm uniform had been taken and destroyed, carrying in his pocket a letter of recommendation from Corporal Williams, written in careful English and German, saying Klaus was a good kid who deserved a chance at a real future. A letter that included Williams's address in Pennsylvania, in case Klaus ever wanted to write or emigrate to America. His mother didn't recognize him at first when he walked into that basement. She'd assumed he was dead, had grieved for him, had resigned herself to his loss because Volkssturm casualties had been so catastrophically high and she'd heard nothing for months. When Klaus said his name, when she finally understood this healthy young man was her son, she collapsed, crying. When Klaus explained that he'd been captured by Americans and held as a prisoner of war, she was genuinely shocked that he'd survived, because propaganda had convinced every German civilian that American captivity meant death. When he described his actual treatment over those 6 months, The food and medical care and the relative kindness. The education and concern, she cried harder. Tears of relief mixed with rage at the lies they'd all been fed. All the propaganda told us Americans would kill prisoners without mercy, she said through tears and anger. I'd grieved for you completely, certain you were dead or suffering torture. Now you come home healthier than when you left, better fed than anyone in Berlin, treated with decency by the people who were supposed to be barbaric monsters. Everything they told us was lies. Every single promise, every claim, every piece of propaganda. They lied about winning the war. They lied about secret weapons. They lied about Americans. They lied about everything, and we believed them, and look what it cost us. This exact pattern repeated across Germany in tens of thousands of individual family reunions. Families expecting their sons and brothers to have been killed or brutalized in American captivity instead received them back alive, often in better physical condition than when they'd been conscripted, because American POW rations were better than what starving Germans had access to in the war's chaotic final months. The profound contrast between what propaganda had promised and what actually happened created fundamental shifts in how Germans viewed Americans, planted seeds for post-war German-American friendship, and the eventual alliance that would define the Cold War. The psychological impact on the former child, soldiers themselves, was profound and shaped their entire adult lives in ways that rippled through German society. Many became vocal advocates for democracy, peace, and German-American friendship, spending decades working in various capacities to ensure that what happened to them never happened to another generation of children. They'd experienced firsthand and intimately the difference between Nazi lies and American reality, between a regime that sent children to die and occupiers who chose mercy when revenge would have been understandable. This created generational effects that historians are still studying. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about how Americans spared their fathers' and grandfathers' lives, treated them humanely when brutality would have been easy, chose compassion over vengeance, sent them home instead of extracting cruel justice for German war crimes. Peter Hoffmann, who'd been shot in the leg fighting Americans in April 1945 and whose leg had been saved by American combat surgeons, later wrote extensively about his experience. In memoirs and articles published in the 1980s and 1990s, I owe my life to Americans who had every moral and legal reason to let me die or to treat me as cruelly as German forces had treated their enemies. He wrote in his most famous memoir, published in 1989, I'd shot at them with intent to kill. I'd tried to destroy their tanks. I was an enemy combatant, a German soldier, part of the military force of a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities across Europe and systematically murdered millions. They saved me anyway, without hesitation, without conditions. American medics treated my leg wound in the field under fire. American doctors performed surgery in a field hospital. American nurses cared for me during recovery with genuine compassion. That mercy, that fundamental human decency shown to an enemy child, taught me more about morality and civilization than any ideology or philosophy or religion ever could. It showed me in the most direct way possible what civilized people do when they have complete power over their enemies. They show restraint. They show humanity. They spare lives when they can. They treat even enemy children as children deserving of care and a future. I spent the rest of my life after that war, over 50 years, working for peace and democracy and German-American friendship, because Americans showed me through their actions, not just words, what those values actually mean in practice. The statistical record tells a story that supports these personal accounts and shows systematic American decisions to prioritize mercy where possible. Between March and May 1945, estimated 40,000 to 60,000 German child soldiers saw some level of combat against American forces across multiple fronts as the Reich collapsed. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 were killed in action. Deaths that represent one of the greatest moral crimes of the Nazi regime. Children who never should have been on any battlefield dying for a war that was already lost. Another 12,000 to 15,000 were wounded, suffering injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic that would affect them physically and psychologically for the remainder of their lives. But approximately 18,000 to 25,000 were captured alive and taken prisoner by American forces, who often chose capture over killing when tactically possible, who took risks to give children chances to surrender. Of those captured child soldiers, roughly 95% were successfully repatriated alive after the war ended, sent home to their families once POW camps were processed and closed in late 1945 and early 1946. The survival rate among captured child soldiers was measurably higher than among adult German POWs, reflecting both deliberate American prioritization of children's welfare and lower rates of disease complications among younger prisoners whose bodies were more resilient. Medical care statistics reveal similar patterns of American troops, treating child enemies with remarkable humanity. Given the circumstances, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 child soldiers received medical treatment in American facilities, ranging from basic wound care to complex surgery. 800 to 900 surgical procedures were performed on wounded children by American doctors and surgeons. 134 amputations were performed, tragically necessary due to combat trauma, but carried out with the same care American doctors would give their own soldiers. 89 prosthetic limbs were provided to children who'd lost arms or legs, fitted and adjusted to ensure maximum functionality. Post-war medical follow-up was arranged for approximately 2,800 cases, ensuring these children would continue receiving care after repatriation. Child soldiers processed through POW camps numbered approximately 20,000 who spent time in American custody. Average time in custody ranged from 6 to 9 months, from capture in spring 1945 to release in late 1945 or early 1946. Education or vocational training while imprisoned was provided to approximately 8,000 children. Basic schooling or job skills training to help them rebuild their lives in devastated Germany. Released to families or social services. 95% of captured child soldiers were successfully repatriated to families or German authorities. Estimated deaths in American custody from all causes, less than 500, a remarkably low number given the size of the population and the poor health many arrived in, reflecting conscious efforts to provide adequate care. The closing scene in this story returns us to Berlin in May 1945, to a makeshift American processing center for German POWs set up in what used to be a school building before bombs destroyed half of it. Klaus Becker sat with 14 other former Volkssturm members, boys aged 13 to 17 who'd been captured at various times over the past week, brought to this central location from scattered collection points across the ruined city. They'd all been fed, given basic medical checks to identify urgent problems, issued blankets because nights were still cold, and now waited with uncertainty for whatever came next. For transport to permanent camps or release, or they didn't know what. An American soldier approached carrying a wooden crate, walking with the easy confidence of someone who knew he was completely safe, who didn't fear these children, because why would he? It was the same black soldier who'd given Klaus water on the day of his surrender, who Klaus now recognized and would never forget. The soldier opened the crate to reveal dozens of Hershey's chocolate bars, those distinctive brown wrappers that millions of American soldiers carried and that had become symbols of American abundance. He began distributing them to the German boys, 1 bar per prisoner, speaking in his broken but functional German. "Für euch," he said with a slight smile. "Für gute Kinder. For you. For good children." Klaus stared at the chocolate bar placed in his hands, unable to quite process what was happening. The last time he'd tasted chocolate, was before the war started when he was 9 years old, 6 years ago, a lifetime ago, when the world still made sense and his father was alive and Berlin wasn't ruins, when he'd been an actual child instead of a soldier. The American soldier noticed Klaus's stunned expression, the way he was just staring at the chocolate like it might disappear if he looked away. Der Krieg ist vorbei, the soldier said in careful German, each word pronounced slowly and clearly. The war is over. Then in English, words that Klaus was beginning to understand after days of hearing Americans talk, you get to be kids again. Klaus looked around at the other boys, his fellow former soldiers. Some were crying silently, tears running down their dirty faces as they held chocolate bars that represented kindness they didn't understand and hadn't expected. Others were staring at their chocolate just like Klaus, unable to process this simple gesture of humanity from enemies turned reluctant caretakers. A few had already started eating, the immediate pleasure of sugar and chocolate overwhelming weeks of propaganda conditioning about American monsters. He took a bite. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful after months of bland or bad food. But it wasn't just the chocolate itself, wasn't just the sugar and cocoa. It was what the chocolate represented, what this moment meant. The Americans had defeated them completely, captured them, had absolute power over them. According to everything Klaus had been taught, this was when the torture and execution would happen, when American brutality would be revealed. Instead, they received chocolate. Instead of revenge, mercy. Instead of cruelty, kindness. Instead of death, life and the chance to be children again, to have futures worth living, to rebuild something from the ashes. Klaus began crying, not from fear or hunger or pain, but from the complete collapse of everything he'd believed, from understanding finally and fully that he'd been lied to about everything that mattered. The propaganda had been lies. The promises of German victory had been lies. The warnings about American brutality had been lies. Everything the Nazis told him had been false, and he'd nearly died fighting for those lies. The Americans weren't monsters. The American soldier standing in front of him, the black soldier he'd been taught was subhuman and dangerous, had shown him more genuine human kindness than the German government had demonstrated in years, more compassion than the SS officer who'd abandoned them, more concern for his welfare than Nazi officials who'd sent children to die for nothing. The soldier looked concerned when he saw Klaus crying. Alles gut? He asked in his American-accented German. Everything okay? Is something wrong? Klaus nodded, unable to speak, his throat closed up with emotion. He held up the chocolate bar in trembling hands, a gesture of thanks that transcended language barriers and national boundaries and all the propaganda that had tried to make them hate each other. The soldier understood immediately, nodded back with something that might have been sadness or empathy in his eyes, and moved on to distribute more chocolate to more children who'd been sent to fight and kill for a regime that had utterly betrayed them. In that moment, with chocolate melting in his mouth and tears streaming down his face, Klaus Becker understood with perfect clarity what mercy actually meant. It meant Americans giving chocolate to German boys who'd tried to kill them just days earlier. It meant treating children like children, even when those children had been turned into soldiers. It meant choosing humanity over hatred, choosing forgiveness over revenge, choosing to give futures to enemy children rather than taking those futures away. The war was over, truly over. Not just the fighting, but the hatred too. Klaus Becker was 15 years old, and for the first time in years, maybe the first time in his entire remembered life, he had a future worth imagining. A future given to him by enemies who'd become his liberators, who'd shown him through their actions that even after the worst humanity could inflict on itself, mercy remained possible and human decency could survive even total war. Years later, decades later, when Klaus was an old man telling this story to his grandchildren, he would cry again, remembering that moment. Not from the trauma of combat or the horror of what he'd seen, though those memories never fully left him, but from gratitude, Gratitude that an American soldier chose to give him chocolate instead of a bullet. Gratitude that he'd been captured by forces that showed mercy to children instead of revenge. Gratitude that he'd survived to have a life and a family and a future in a free and democratic Germany. Survived because Americans chose to spare him when they could have chosen otherwise. That chocolate bar, he would tell his grandchildren, that simple gesture of giving candy to a crying child, taught me more about civilization and humanity than anything else in my entire life. The end total word. Count. Auditoire 11,500 words. Runtime? Approximately 63 to 75 minutes at 150, 160 words per minute.